My brother Zach once said, the greatest tragedy in life is when we stop talking to God. At the time, his statement caught me a bit by surprise, but the more I thought about it, the more wisdom I saw in his words. Now, assuming he's right, what do you think is the second greatest tragedy in life? This is Brad Bright. Welcome to the God is Issue podcast, where I show how God is the issue in every issue. Why? Because we can trace all our human problems to our view of God. Now, if you find this podcast helpful, please remember to like and subscribe. And when subscribing, don't forget to click on the bell so you'll be notified whenever I post a new podcast. I believe the second greatest tragedy in life is when we stop talking with our neighbor. Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love God, and the second greatest commandment was to love our neighbor. How are you going to extend love to your neighbor if you never talk with him or her? Historically, the primary vehicle for the spread of the gospel is conversation, relationship. It was not the preaching of the gospel that catapulted Christianity to dominance in the Roman Empire. It was the relating of the gospel. In China today, we see that exact same pattern repeating. As a result, there are now more Christians than communists in communist China today. You see, the enemy of our soul rejoices when we build walls, pulling away from those who are lost simply because they act like it. It impedes the spread of the gospel. Unfortunately, we do much the same thing to many of our brothers and sisters in Christ as well. Look, I consider myself a conservative, okay? I have Christian brothers and sisters who are not conservative. But I am convinced they love Jesus too. I am very willing to work shoulder to shoulder with them to advance the gospel of Jesus. My commitment to the Great Commission far out exceeds my commitment to any ideology. Now think about this. Jesus had two radically different disciples, Simon the Zealot and Matthew the tax collector. Wow. We read over that quickly, but any Jew of Jesus' day who heard that would have gone, what in heaven's name? You see, Zealots hated the Romans and any fellow Jew who aided or abetted their Roman overlords. It's like black Democrats who brand black Republicans Uncle Toms. But you see, Simon and Matthew overcame their polarizing differences to follow Jesus. I remember one incident that occurred during my time on staff with Crew at the UW, the University of Washington. One of the freshman students, a new believer, pulled me aside one evening, and he related how an older Christian brother had accusingly asked him how he could possibly vote for Bill Clinton and call himself a Christian. It rocked his newfound faith. Now, before I say anything else, let me be crystal clear. I did not vote for Bill Clinton. I thought he was a pathological liar, or a serial adulterer, a scoundrel, and an accomplice to mass abortion. You get the idea? In light of that, how do you think I responded to that young man? Here's what I said. I am so sorry. Let me apologize to you on behalf of my brother. I consider myself very politically conservative, but my ideology pales to insignificance compared to my passion for Jesus. So I hope you will continue to follow Jesus and forgive your brother who hurt you. Those words pulled that kid back from the brink. But folks, in the process, I never compromised truth and I never compromised love. Who you vote for is very important. Who you follow is the very essence of life. You see, Simon and Matthew made that same choice. They didn't suddenly, jettison their personal views when they decided to follow Jesus. I imagine there was probably some friction, especially early on. However, they both decided that following Jesus was far more important. We should do likewise, not with our eyes shut, but with the compelling conviction that the reason God leaves us here on this planet is to help fulfill His Great Commission. You see, rescuing people from an eternity without God is the ultimate expression of what loving our neighbor really means. If we can't lay aside our differences to help fulfill the Great Commission, then frankly, our ideologies are no longer simply ideologies. They're idols. They have usurped the supremacy of Jesus Christ in our lives. But now, let me talk about the culture that we live in today. How can we build bridges of love for the sake of the gospel without compromising God's truth? You see, the pagans in our neighborhood, schools, and businesses are our neighbors, and Jesus commanded us to love them. and that requires we must talk with them. Now, Chip and Joanna Gaines of Fixer Upper fame, and you've probably heard of them, what's going on, they now have their own network called the Magnolia Network. They recently included a homosexual couple on one of their shows. And not surprisingly, they took a lot of heat from the Christian community. May I tell you what I think Chip got right? He's trying to reach out with the love of Christ to those in our culture who are horribly lost. Folks, there are a lot of followers of Jesus who aren't even trying to reach their next door neighbor, much less those who are sexually broken. You see, at least Chip and Joanna care enough to try, unlike many of their critics. But I use Chip and Joanna as an example because I want to talk about what it looks like to never compromise love and never compromise truth. I think Chip got the love part right, but did he get the truth part right? You see, Jesus hung out with tax collectors and sinners, didn't he? To Zacchaeus, a hated tax collector, Jesus said in front of a lot of people, "Come down, Zach. I want to have dinner in your home tonight." There were a lot of people within earshot who heard Jesus say that. Can you imagine what all the gossips were murmuring? Did you hear Jesus wants to have dinner with Zach tonight? Doesn't he know who Zach is? Zach is a tax collector. Zach is a dirty Roman lover. Can't you hear the whispers? So I come back again to the question. Do you think Chip Gaines got the never compromise truth part right? Here's the question we believe we must answer first. What is the primary goal of the homosexual community in America today? It's for their behavior to become perceived as normal, as they say, normalized. And what is their primary strategy? It's to flood all forms of visual media with pictures of homosexual couples so that we become accustomed to seeing them, especially younger Americans. Now, if you don't believe me, go read the book After the Ball, which is written by two homosexuals who are incredibly shrewd marketers. I read it cover to cover. Believe them. Or believe the two homosexuals that Chip put on his show. I want you to listen to what they said in an interview about being on Chip and Joanna's show.
And like, we are your neighbors and your coworkers. And so it was this great, amazing opportunity to normalize same-sex couples and same-sex families.
To normalize same-sex couples and same-sex families. Did you catch that? You see, I think Chip has a huge heart. But Jesus also commanded us to be as shrewd as snakes, and Chip wasn't very shrewd. He reinforced their narrative. So did Chip compromise truth? Well, not intentionally, but yes, I think so. I think he did. But there is one thing we need to learn from Chip about building bridges of love across the huge divide in our culture. Here's what Chip said: talk, ask questions, and listen. Folks, that's a great way to get a conversation started. You see, Jesus started the conversation with Zacchaeus by saying, "Hey, Zach, can we grab dinner tonight?" So let me give you one of my favorite questions to use when someone's talking about homosexual behavior or abortion or transgenders or DEI or white privilege or illegal immigration, etc. I wonder, on a scale of 1 to 10, how strongly would you say you feel about that? Now, if they say anything other than a 10, perhaps maybe an 8, then follow it up with, what would it take to move you from an 8 to a 9? Not an 8 to a 7. They'll get defensive if you ask that. But an 8 to a 9, that's non-threatening, folks. And now they're even going to tell you what their misgivings are about their own position. But whatever they answer, you can then ask, on a scale of 1 to 10, how strongly do you think God feels about that and why? Folks, now you've started a God conversation. All you need to do is keep this pointy little finger out of the air. And of course, from there, you can ask, hey, just out of curiosity, do you think you might be able to describe for me how you see God? And then finally here, you can end with this one. I wonder, do you believe it's possible to have a personal and intimate relationship with God? Now, folks, did you notice how I used I wonder and, just out of curiosity to soften the questions? However, I don't want you to miss the most important point. And that's that you just moved the conversation a long way in the right direction, and all you did was ask questions. Like Chip said, talk, ask questions, and listen. Can you do that? With a generation who craves to be seen, to be heard, that's your meal ticket, folks. See, the greatest tragedy in life is when we stop talking with God. And the second greatest tragedy is when we stop talking with our neighbor. God is the issue in every issue, especially the issue of loving our neighbor. This is Brad Bright. Thanks for joining me today. God bless.